Good morning, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to introduce a new project that we're actually just getting off the ground to develop a data resource to make basic information about the whole of New Zealand's introduced flora more readily available for research and management. And I see this as a great opportunity to present the project as it's starting and actually get lots of feedback as we would like to have it, to know what's important to you, how can we incorporate data you may have or important data, or basically make this a project that would be very useful for management. And this work is meant to complement the really excellent work that's being done throughout Manaki Whenua on particular species and groups of introduced plant species that have become problematic or are potentially really important to maintain in the landscape because they provide important economic benefits, but we of course want to keep them in the places where we want them to be. The other hope about this project is to potentially integrate across what I'm calling in this slide different management landscapes. So we may have landscapes where there's quite a bit of primary industry and introduced species actually play an important role, but we also have landscapes and important wilderness areas, and we find introduced plants in both of these, and the management implications or needs or approaches might be quite different. But in some cases, the species may actually be the same, and so integrating the information more widely and making it more readily available could be quite useful. And also thinking about cases where those important conservation landscapes or patches may be interspersed within a wider landscape of different types of land use, such as shrubland fragments within the eastern South Island, where the native shrubland can be encroached upon by introduced grasses in this case. So we have a couple of main aims in this project. Our more immediate aim, which is what I'm going to focus on talking about today, is current state of knowledge of getting basically a basic set of information about attributes for the entire introduced flora together and available to a wider range of end users. And this includes information such as how many species we have, what their status is, what they are, what kinds of forms they have, where they've come from, where they occur in New Zealand. And an important point about this is that some of this information is quite static. We only need to collect it once, and then we can use that information as long as those species are present in New Zealand. Other information is quite dynamic, and we want to create a system that will allow us to update that information, such as when new species arrive, or as species may spread or shift in status from casual to naturalized, for example. More ultimately, we hope that this kind of resource could be used to help improve our predictions around naturalization risk and impact and management of introduced plants, including better understanding naturalization rates, the process from species arrival to escape to naturalization, understanding and predicting which regions and habitats might be more at risk. And as an example, I've put up a photo here of the Kettle Hole wetlands in the Mackenzie country, and in those very flood-prone centers of those ephemeral wetlands, they're actually quite a wonderful refuge against introduced species at the moment, because that flooding regime prevents a lot of those introduced grasses from invading. But with certain climate change or other management changes, we may actually reduce the strength of that resilience, and we could actually produce a greater risk from species, introduced species that are already present even within those particular habitats or right next door. We're also interested in acquiring and adding and understanding key attributes for predicting and spread and impact, understanding which species in this whole list of the flora become environmental weeds, for example, what characteristics and what differentiates those from the rest of the flora, thinking about reproductive mechanisms and dispersal mechanisms to better understand potential spread of species that are present but maybe not widespread, and also which kinds of attributes could we add into this database that could be important for understanding potential ecosystem impacts, such as nitrogen fixers or flammability traits of species. So our first aim in this project is to make data that are already out there more accessible. And the first start with this is drawing on existing databases that are not yet published. And the first example of this is a database of the species that were introduced by the year 2000 that was compiled by Hazel Gatehouse for her PhD and exists within her thesis, but the raw data are not widely available. And it shows that we had over 2,000 species, introduced plant species, present outside of captivity in New Zealand by the year 2000. The majority of those had naturalized, and just over 300 were considered environmental weeds by the Department of Conservation. And this database was updated in 2008-2009 and reflected just a few minor changes to the list. But now we've been updating this species list thanks to the work of the systematics team at Manaki Whenua, who've produced checklists of the flora for the last couple of years. And at this stage, we see that we've actually jumped quite a bit in the number of introduced plant species outside captivity. But actually, the number of naturalized species hasn't increased too much. So I think in some ways that represents an opportunity for us to potentially prevent that shift from being just a casual present species to naturalizing. And the timing of this project is really great because the Department of Conservation is currently updating their environmental weeds list as well. We're working closely with Clayson Howell on this project, so we'll be able to include that update within these species lists and data resources. For these species present in these existing lists, we have almost complete coverage for basic species attributes, but we'd also like to add on to that specifically with traits that are of high priority for potential end users of this data resource. So real quickly, I'm going to go through just a few of the pieces of information that we have currently for this, for these species, and a little bit about where we'll go next. So currently in the checklist, there are over 2,800 species of introduced plants in New Zealand. These are found in 193 families and over 1,100 genera, so it's actually quite a diverse group of plants. And I was just going to show a little bit about the distribution of those in 4 different kind of taxonomic groups. We have at the top here the flowering plants, monocots and dicots. Here the gymnosperms, mostly conifers. And down here, I think sometimes possibly more overlooked, are the ferns and their allies. So the largest group of non-natives we have introduced plants are the dicots, and these are, there are over 2,080 species there. And the 5 most speciose families up there are probably quite familiar ones for everyone here. We have the daisies, represented in part by familiar players like thistles, legumes, which we know see quite a bit around the South Island, such as gorse, and also roses, mints, and mustards. But as you can see, there's most of the dicots are in other families, possibly less well known or recognized. The monocots, perhaps not surprisingly, the 617 species here are mostly represented by the grasses. A lovely photo of dune grass there, Ammophila arenaria. Also the sedges and rushes, so very well known. Also irises and asparagus family, including this little guy climbing asparagus. But actually, really, the main player is the grasses. Quite a smaller number of gymnosperms, only 56 species, mostly represented by the pine family, but also the cypress family, such as macrocarpas, and then a couple other individuals in there, podocarps, Araucaria, ginkgo. And then finally the ferns, the smallest group, only 55 species. Some examples, such as in that most specious family, Dryopteridaceae, it's the male fern, but also this includes allies like the club mosses. This is Selaginella kraussiana. So that's the non-native flora as a whole, as of 2017 to 2018. And most of these species are naturalized, but it's still it still is a smaller number. So there is a gap here between species present outside captivity and species that are actually naturalized. The composition of that naturalized flora is relatively similar. It's still the same players in most of these groups, except for the U family actually comes out in the gymnosperms, particular note. And just as a comparison, the flora, the native vascular flora, includes only 2,200 species. So at this point, we've more than doubled the diversity of plant life in New Zealand with introduced species. It's kind of interesting. A few more characteristics. I'm only focusing here on the flowering plants, monocots and dicots, because the ferns are largely herbaceous. There are a couple of tree fern species in there, and the gymnosperms are mostly trees, a few shrubs. So this is just a group, just 7 different types of growth forms that the flowering plants are composed of, including trees, ranging to shrubs, and down to herbs and cespitous forms, herbaceous forms, and vines. And you'll notice most of the species are herbaceous. So what's interesting here is both to consider just what kinds of types of plants are present, but also which types of growth forms might be most important for management. And my first off guess, and others have mentioned this too, is probably certain species that would scream out as being potentially of high risk right off the bat might be vines or those with climbing habits. That could be a really important attribute to include right away, just to perhaps put us on our guard a little bit about certain species potentially of higher risk. And then focusing just on these herbaceous species, thinking a little bit about what their lifespan is. And here we have a lifespan ranging from annual through to biennial, or just potentially annual to perennial, and then all the way to only perennial. And interestingly enough, the majority of the herbaceous non-native flowering plants are actually perennial, which I think actually to me was a bit of a surprise, because we think of a lot of annual species as being very weedy. And it could be that knowing which species have an annual habit is really important, because that starts to suggest they'd have fast growth rates, high reproduction, and also some implications for not holding soil well, or being more flammable potentially. But also I think understanding about other aspects that could make perennial weeds of higher risk, potentially being sleeper weeds, where they may take longer to get to reproductive age, but that might make us complacent, and perhaps we need to think about what kinds of population growth factors could lead to those species becoming more problematic, or just the fact that they do stick around for a lot longer potentially. We're currently working on filling in gaps for the new species added to the list in terms of their origins, both in terms of which continents and countries they've come from, but also floristic regions, which might be more helpful for understanding what kinds of climatic factors they can tolerate or would support their spread. And this is just an example figure for the introduced conifers to New Zealand. On the top here is a heat map showing the percent of introduced conifers by their floristic region of origin. So you can see that actually up to 25% of the conifers have come from Eastern Asia or North America. But this bottom one actually shows the naturalized conifers. And here you see that actually the highest donor for naturalized conifers is the boreal region. So there's some interesting distinctions between which regions of the world are providing us with species that can escape from captivity, but which ones versus which ones actually become naturalized. The other point that we're working on updating as well is occurrence within New Zealand. And this is a figure from Hazel's thesis showing occurrences by the year 2000, but this is the type of information that we really appreciate help with updating in particular. But she divided New Zealand into 10 roughly political regions and indicated the number of introduced plant species in each of those regions. The dark bars are the naturalized ones, the gray bars are the casual. And you can see Auckland region is the highest, possibly not surprising to anyone, but you might notice Canterbury comes in at a close second. So it will be interesting to see how this has changed from the year 2000 to now. But another way to also think about this is for each of those introduced species, how many New Zealand regions do they occupy? How widespread are they? And there are quite a few who are present everywhere, but the greatest number, and especially in terms of casual species, are present only in one region. And so what kind of opportunities does that present for management and even potential eradication, as we talked about earlier today? But another way of thinking about this and of potential importance to management is not just which political regions, but also which ecoregions or habitats are these species present in, or are they actually most likely to invade. And here again, just an example for the conifers of which ecoregions have the highest percentage of wild conifers present compared to lower percentages. So after throwing all that information at you, just want to say that the first thing we're doing is compiling this information right now to write up a review of the current state of knowledge about basic traits and attributes of the introduced flora as a whole. We'll be providing information that is most readily available, hopefully also quite useful to end users, and highlighting where there might be some key gaps, which species are just hard to find information about, or do we know the least about. And publishing this, the database at this point online in the Landcare Data Store, and also exploring options for linking it up with other databases to provide an opportunity for it to update perhaps more automatically, and also provide links to where other information can be found about these species. But ultimately, we want this to be a living resource, a living project that can support research and management. And so we're going to be working after this first review more on updating current distributions for these species and prioritizing attributes to add to the database to meet management priorities. So if there are particular species, groups of species, attributes that you particularly would want to know, would want to see in a resource like this, we'd really appreciate your feedback on that. So with that, I'll take any questions.